So hello everybody, we are here after the producers conference in November 2012 in Berlin, sitting happily relaxed after this good show in the hotel, and next to me is Gary Bromham. He's been one of the top spots of the conference yesterday, and Gary is a very renowned mixing engineer. You've been working at Olympic Studios. You're the man with the deep knowledge of the SSL consoles.
In theory.
And have an impressive track record. Maybe in a couple of sentences, let the people know who you are.
Okay. Actually, I started my career in a very strange place. I started in Reykjavik when I was about 20 years old. I'm considerably older than that now. And I work with a band called Mezza Forte, and I also work with an artist you may have heard of called Björk, in a very early incarnation of what Björk does. I also did their Eurovision entry. Maybe not such a great credit. Then I, through meeting a recording engineer in Reykjavik, called Paul Gomersall, I was introduced to George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley. Some of you may remember Wham from the 80s,
sure.
80s child. And I then went on to write and produce Andrew's solo album. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
So you went with the other guy?
Unfortunately, I went with the less talented half of Wham. Fortunately, most of the work I did, the production work I did on the album, was actually with George, because Andrew was busy chatting up the ladies and crashing cars, actually. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So even worse than what George became known for afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's artists for you.
Yeah, artists. So I suppose really, as a result of, I always believe in opportunities in your career, and what happened with working with Andrew and George is I then signed a publishing deal with Warner Chappell Music. I also went to work in Los Angeles, and I worked with lots of different people. There's a band called The Tubes, Fee Waybill, you may have heard of.
The Tubes, wow.
Yeah, The Tubes.
They were pretty big in Germany also.
Yeah, they had a fairly outrageous live show, I remember. I won't go into that on camera.
White Punks on Dope became one of the most successful German songs in the 80s from a German singer called Nina Hagen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that band, at that time it was the Nina Hagen Band, and the song was called Ich Glotz TV. They made a German version of White Punks on Dope.
Yeah. So he had a fairly outrageous live show. I don't know, you may remember that.
Yeah, I've seen them live two times.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And one of the artists I met whilst working in LA, she at the time was signed to Warner Chappell, as I was as a songwriter, was Sheryl Crow. And Sheryl Crow, we wrote lots of songs together. This was before really she had aspirations of being an artist. At the time she was a backing singer for Don Henley and also for Michael Jackson. We did loads of tunes together, and around that sort of point she decided that she wanted to be an artist, as most sort of self-respecting songwriters do at one point. They always have that artist kind of bug. And that was the start of a long kind of musical relationship with Sheryl Crow. Yeah.
So fast forwarding to now. So I
to
understand,
Olympics maybe.
You said you were a songwriter and producer,
and
arranger.
Yeah.
And so now you're well, that's how I met you.
As a mix engineer.
You have the mixing engineer tag.
Yeah,
how changed that, or how do these things come together?
Actually, what happened was, as a lot of musicians, I often, when things are going really well in my career, I end up destroying them and changing things. And in the mid-90s, I was actually signed to EMI Records as an artist. I had a band called The Big Blue in the UK, which was pretty successful. And then, as what happens to a lot of artists, we got dropped from our label, and I then had a life crisis. I thought, right, okay, what am I doing? And up to that point, I'd always made rock music, or pop rock music, and I decided to go for a complete change, and I started doing making these records, which we called garage. Some of you who make dubstep now, you'll be familiar with we called it two-step, which was quite a departure from what I'd done. And what happened was pure luck, the first record I did turned out to be a number 3 record in the charts in the UK. I wrote this and I mixed it, and I suddenly thought, actually,
Wait. You wrote it, you produced it?
Yeah, I wrote it and produced it with the artist, and we were going to get somebody else to mix it, and I just thought, actually, I'll mix this because I think I know what it needs. And then I suddenly developed a name for myself for mixing those two-step records, which I thought was very funny, because already I was kind of in my early 30s and thinking, I'm kind of maybe too old to be doing this kind of music, but I think I probably had an approach where I understood the theory of mixing, and therefore I just brought that to the table, whereas a lot of those guys that are making two-step records weren't too worried about whether they didn't sound that great, whereas I wanted to make them sound great.
What was the name of the track?
Actually, it was called Summer of Love. It was by an artist called Lonyo.
Okay.
So I did that, and there was another big record I had in the UK called Push the Feeling On.
I have one question in between before I forget it. Excuse me if I interrupt. So when you were mixing that record, what were you using at that?
Oh, you're going to love this.
So how came the instruments together? I mean, I assume there was some guitar involved, some Akai stuff, some synth.
Actually, it was very, very simple. The whole principle of two-step was the beats were always done on an Akai MPC, and we just used a Roland JV 1080, and we used, literally for bass, we had an organ, a sine wave, and maybe a kind of Moogie thing, and we used to mix those three. And I used a Korg Triton for most of the synths. There wasn't any guitar on there. And the great thing is, obviously I'm known for mixing with an SSL. The secret actually with that record was it was all mixed on a Mackie 32 input. Okay. So it was pretty lo-fi. But I still believe that you should never blame the tools that you're using, and I believe that if you're good at what you do, then you should be able to mix something on a Mackie.
So if I get this right, this was all straight from the sequencer into the desk?
Yep.
No tape or something involved?
Logic. And very early version, probably Logic 4.
And then straight to DAT or 2-inch?
Straight. Oh no, that would have been to DAT, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the time, the year roughly around?
Around about 2000.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and then you extended your activities in that genre. Yeah,
absolutely. And I started mixing for a lot of different people, and had probably 5 or 6 quite big hits in the UK. And then I suddenly started to want to branch up. The kind of old passion for real music came back, and I started.
So what's real music? I mean, it's electronic and handmade
well, real
music.
record. Yeah, I should qualify that by saying, otherwise I'll get in a lot of trouble from people watching.
No. There shouldn't be any trouble. But there is this. We had this discussion like 2 weeks ago when we were at the SAE alumni convention. There's this gentleman who was raving about. That hip-hop stuff and this program stuff, that's not real music, and there's so much more I would say complicated or with a lot of brains to it music, and he was like worshipping this and taking down the other stuff, and I said, well, that's like culture criticism. Let the audience decide what they want. You can't say there's good music or bad music.
No, just different music. Yeah,
so
absolutely. So I should qualify it by saying different music. What I wanted to do is I wanted to mix things with more live instruments. That's what I'm really trying to say. As opposed to just program material. In my experience, one of the things I found is when you're mixing, it's much easier to get a mix quite quickly with things that have been recorded live, because you don't have to compensate for the natural ambience. When you're doing stuff in the box and stuff that's all been programmed, you need to create a kind of artificial ambience there and put it into a space, into a false space, and that can sometimes be more tricky. Does that make? I hope that makes sense. If you have natural, like a live drum, a real drummer.
Yeah, I usually just try to describe this. If you have something out of the box, or a synthesizer, or something from the computer, a computer generated, there's no air, no room around it.
Yeah.
only if it comes with some
Yeah.
built-in effect. And if you stick a microphone out there,
Yeah.
you always have this, you capture the aspects of the room
Yeah.
with it. Even if it's just one microphone,
Yeah.
you have this room impression. So things are like not
Yeah.
this, they have like a place in space.
Yeah, actually, can I talk about that for a moment? Because
Sure.
this is something I'm quite passionate about. I think one of the problems, so many records sound the same now because they're made with the same software, they use the same sound sources, and natural air around a sound is missing from a lot of modern record production, which is what gives the personality. I mean, if you listen to a lot of those great records, the sort of dark, I'm thinking kind of Dark Side of the Moon or Led Zeppelin, the natural ambience around, or the air around those sounds, is what gave it the personality. And it's very hard to recreate that later. And actually, I've noticed that I think there's a band called Hot Chip, I don't know if you've heard of them.
Sure.
I've noticed that they are actually, even though they're recording stuff with machines and things, they're actually starting to mic up some of those synths and those program sources to give them this natural air, which I think is an interesting concept.
Yeah, that's true. And to be honest, I just realized a couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure to interview Franz Blaser, who is a studio owner in Hamburg and a big producer in Germany. And he was talking about that he, at some point in the 80s, there was this Bon Jovi sound with the dry in-your-face drums and stuff.
He
didn't like that. And he started to experiment with old instruments, which produced hiss and weird noises, and running several amplifiers at the same time and all feeding them into the whole mix. And he said that sometimes he thinks that this noise is more important than the pure signal, because it glues things together and it helps to create this overall picture which has this atmosphere. And actually that's true, because I mean, what Matthias Hegström-Gerd is always saying now in his presentations, the first point, record something, because you bring something in which could be then, if you don't hear it in the end, it can hold all the elements which come later together, maybe.
I totally agree. I think to bring personality into something, you really do need to put things in. I mean, when I'm mixing something, I try to put things in their own space. If you have to do that artificially, it's much harder to kind of recreate that. I'm not saying for one moment that you don't add echo, delays and reverb and things, because obviously you have to do that. But what I tend to do is, there's a kind of mentality now where people use a lot of reverbs with inserts, if that makes sense. Whereas my approach would always be, well, I'll set up maybe 3 or 4 reverbs and make those work for the whole mix. The mix tends to not glue together as well if you're using all these, what I would call in English, disparate elements, where everything's in its own space. For me, the drums need to share a common denominator, and the guitars need to share a common denominator. So maybe it comes from my kind of an old-fashioned way of working, where you would walk into a studio and if you were lucky you had 3 reverbs, so you would have to make those work. But I still believe that when you mix in the box now, if you're mixing in Reason, for me, I still need to bring some of that analog mentality with me. I need to, there's a cliche, but mixing in the box involves some thinking out of the box. So I very much fly that flag.
Mixing in the box needs thinking out of the box. That's a very important sentence. We should keep that in our minds.
Yeah, I think so.
Great. Okay, let's move on for this conversation here today. We might extend that. So what are you working on these days, and who are you working with, and what floats your boat, so to say? What are you?
Well,
really
actually, currently, I said I would never do this again, but actually, I'm flirting with the idea of my own project. I'm actually, some of you may know Richard Barbieri from Japan in the 80s, and then more recently Porcupine Tree.
Yes, sure.
Richard and I, really through both working in Reason, we met at a show actually, and we started talking, and we became really good friends. We went out for a kind of lunch one day, and we just talked for hours and hours. And I actually said to him, "Do you mind if I record this?" Because I was starting to find this really interesting. There was a lot of sort of common denominators, and we decided, or we'd start. He just said to me, "Do you fancy doing some music together?" So actually, that's one thing I'm kind of working on at the moment is a project with Richard. More recently, I don't know if a band called 9 Below Zero. Did they ever do anything here?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just mixed a 9 Below Zero album called Never Too Late. Very interesting for me because I mixed it and there was nothing sequenced. It was all live.
Mm-hmm.
That was, and actually I found that I could mix 2 or even 3 of these songs on this album a day. It was very, and there were never more than 30 tracks. So that was quite refreshing, and it was very
13. 1 3.
30.
30. Okay.
13.
Okay.
Not 13.
Oh, I'm relieved.
Yeah. That would have been few, actually. That would have been. Yeah. So 9 Below Zero. Obviously, I'm quite closely connected to the Propeller Heads thing, so I'm also doing quite a lot of stuff with artists in the UK using Reason. There's an artist called Casper, who is a well-known dubstep guy. I'm not really working with him. I'm just bringing him on board because he's always used Reason. And I'm very interested to see how people work, their work method. I've always had my method, but I'm now starting to really look at how other people work. And the role of the DAW is constantly evolving, isn't it? And he uses it very much like a performance tool, which for me, one of the exciting things about Reason.
You said Reason, and you realized that the sun
came
out.
The reason the sun came out. One of the things which has occurred to me with several DAWs, am I allowed to mention other DAWs here or not really?
Yeah, sure. We're
Pro Tools. I mean, Pro Tools is great. Pro Tools is a post-production tool. It's for finishing things. And for me, it's more geared towards film. It's great at doing surround, that kind of thing. But I don't see Pro Tools as a creative tool. One of the things which really drew me to Reason is that it's very much a creative tool. And I used to use Reason with rewired into Pro Tools. And so when Record 1 came out, I was doing a TPC producer conference in just outside London, and when they released that, I thought, oh, this is fantastic, because nobody has actually realized or simulated what a mixing disc actually is in terms of workflow in software. Yeah, they've approximated it, but for me, I always see the Reason mixer as its own device. And it's probably, the good thing with Reason is it's very open-ended. You can work however you want to, but I tend to use the mixer as my go-to device, and I do everything in there, and then maybe I'll add things in the rack. So I tend to work with the mixer and the rack. That's my sort of...
Yeah, but you still do work with the thing itself as well. So you are sitting quite often behind the SSL. And,
I work with the hardware a lot. I still do quite a lot of stuff with the Duality and the AWS, which is the large format console. And I love doing that. It's a kind of different workflow. I like the fact that I have 24 or 48 faders, and I actually I know this sounds strange, I like to mix standing up. I like to run around a bit.
Yeah, sure.
And I like to be able to do more than... One of the criticisms I always make of the DAW is that you can only do one thing with a mouse, whereas when I'm working with a mixing disc, I'm probably moving several faders and doing several things at the same time. And for me, it's always been a much quicker... I've always felt that I can mix something much faster on a hardware console than I could in the box, just because I can do many things at the same time.
Yeah, and I think we had this yesterday also. The process is also slightly different, because if you start writing within a DAW, or preferably in Reason, as you build your track, you fit the instruments in where they have their space. So you're constantly in mixing mode. But if you get a finished project and you need to and you're asked to mix it, then you have to where you from there have to find spaces for the instruments. I think you're right that a console where you can interactively, like, okay, if this goes here, if I do it here, how these things could go together. It's definitely a different process.
Yeah.
Just not to get too much into that subject is something else. What's surround for you this whole situation? Since, I don't know, 10 years at the AES's industry, try to push the surround for the music consumers into the market.
I have to confess, I've
do you think
never.
that it has picked up, or did it do something for you? Does it do something for you?
The problem I have with surround is, and I've only kind of had a brief flirtation with mixing with surround. One of the problems for me is that it loses impact. As soon as you bring things outside of the stereo field and you start doing clever things where delays are bouncing around behind you, I think that's fine, but you still need a solid center. It comes down, actually, in mixing, I always think about the importance of mono. Mono is very important, and people often say to me, well, what's the point in listening to stuff in mono? Because nobody listens in mono, everyone listens in stereo, and really they're missing the point. The whole idea of mono is balance. Everything needs to be balanced in mono to have weight and solidity, if that makes sense. And as soon as you come outside of that, you start to dilute the sound, if you know what I mean, which is why the dance guys, be it house or hip-hop, that kind of thing, they all realise that the vocal, the bass and the kick in the centre is really the most important thing. The other stuff is kind of the fairy dust, if you like. For me, going back to surround, one of the things that what does work is what I call enhanced stereo. And there's a really good I'm trying to think of the album, Nick Cave did a great album where it's stereo, but it just is slightly outside of stereo, which makes it a bit more interesting. That I prefer to things bouncing around. Like, I mean, I don't know whether you've heard the Depeche Mode remixes in surround.
I was able to listen to them once. I think they were from DTS or something. Yeah. Supported by DTS. And a friend of mine actually worked with them at that time when they came out. So I had a brief listen at one of the trade shows. But that's also the thing. I always were able to listen to this at trade shows because I personally have never met someone who had a decent 5.1 setup or something else at home. Yeah. You have that consumer cinema systems where I very often find, especially in women's apartments, you have the two front and rear left speakers on top of each other next to the TV set. And that's about it. Very often. So the surround thing seems to do not really...
It's quadrophonic. Basically, if you look at
the consumer,
the way the original, I mean, if we go back to the 70s, excuse me, Dark Side of the Moon was mixed for quadrophonic, and really, I see a lot of the home surround systems. Really, they're quadrophonic. They're not really 5.1 or certainly not 7.1. For me, if you're going to do that, you need to have a great listening environment for it to work properly, because there's all these dilemmas you have when you're mixing surround. You know, do I the LFE, the sub, do I allow that to go above 80 hertz, or do I restrict it to 80 hertz? Now, one of the misconceptions with bass, people think that bass is because of the longitudinal nature of the waveforms, it's that it isn't directional, but actually bass is quite directional. And I notice that a lot of people have subs and they'll say, oh well, it doesn't need to be in the middle, but actually every experience I've ever had is that it's critical where the sub sits. So therefore, if we put that off to the corner or in the side, then that's probably not going to work. So it comes back to needing a perfect listening environment.
Yeah. That's true. And there's this guy in Germany, the company is called Neo Audio Technology. He just came out with a virtual mixing system, which is available for Pro Tools now, where you can choose basically whatever format, surround format, you want, like 5.1, 7.1, or even 3D audio, like
Yeah.
totally spatial.
Yeah.
And he claims that you can mix in space
Yeah.
over your headphones.
Is that like a binaural thing, like the binaural?
No, you have standard headphones,
Right.
normal headphones.
Okay,
And
yeah.
he's building basically this mixing environment for you virtually.
Yeah.
And then you mix and do your stuff and position your instruments, and then you can, well, export it either as the 7.1 or whatever
Yeah.
mix, so that it works on the proper array system,
Right.
or export a headphone mix.
So down mix it, if you like, a kind of down mix. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but keeping the spatialization. So I haven't checked it out myself yet. I've seen a demo. So I thought if it's, because a lot of people are listening to music on headphones.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if there would be something which would take the thing out of your head just a little bit more. Capabilities of positioning things. I mean, keeping the impact, but there are some things like
Yeah.
reverbs and keyboard stuff here and there to
Yeah.
create more like an auditive space.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty interesting. Would you see that that could be fun to come up with, like you do the stereo mix,
Yeah.
and then also on top of this a headphone mix, which would
Yeah,
be
absolutely.
slightly more
In fact,
surround?
I'm racking my brains as you're speaking to think of the manufacturer that brought some surround headphones out. Because somebody produced some surround headphones, didn't they? Was it AKG or was it somebody? I can't.
Not that I know.
I wish I could remember. I don't know whether it was Bayer. Somebody brought some headphones out. They weren't cheap. That had that could do the kind of, I think even the 7.1 sort of thing. I'm not sure how they would have done the sub, but there was a more directional, three-dimensional thing.
Okay.
In answer to your question, I think that's really exciting. Yeah, and I think
So, note to self, which is me. I will make sure that I talk to Tom Ammerman next week to
Okay.
get Gary this. It's called the Spatial Audio Designer.
Right.
It's a plugin, and it's available already for Pro Tools.
okay.
So I'm sure he would be very, very happy to get some feedback from you
Yeah, I'll be delighted to.
about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm really excited about the idea of three-dimensional sound, and the future, I think, is three-dimensional sound. The point that I'm making is, how do we keep the impact there? Because as soon as you start moving stuff around, it tends to lose a lot of its impact. Actually, the center speaker becomes more important. I know that traditionally with film, that's where the dialogue will tend to go. But actually, if we're looking at conventional mixing of maybe a pop record, that center speaker becomes very, very important in terms of keeping the impact, particularly if you're doing something like compressing your whole mix. I mean, in Reason we talked yesterday about the bus compressor. There needs to be a lot of focus for that bus compressor in the center, or just the left and right speakers.
Yeah.
The problem with compression is it changes the timing, and if it isn't working properly with the rear, then the whole timing of your mix becomes it loses a kind of focus, if that makes sense. It's really something where I'd have to actually show you what I mean rather than try and explain it. It to my ears, there's always something that happens between front and back with compression, and I use that's part of what I do. I use a lot of compression, so it's keeping that the impact of that compression in the surround field. How do I communicate that? So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's true, and that's a challenge, a huge challenge. This just reminds me, I went because I was exposed to a lot of surround stuff very, very early, and I was always a skeptic. I had once, there was a production which was produced for surround, a German band called Guano Apes, and they had the guitars like in the four, like 5 guitars here, 5 there, 5 there, like metal stuff. That was like, and the drums and the bass came from the front.
Yeah.
That was quite an experience.
Yeah, I'm sure.
This never made, this never surfaced as a product for the people out there. And listening environment like this, nobody would have that anyways.
No.
So the headphone thing, I think, is pretty interesting, because that might be a chance to reach the consumer,
Yeah.
who would in the end decide what's hot and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I digress, but I just wanted to say that I went to the cinema recently, and there's this new iSense technology in Germany where they charge, I don't know, €4 more if you want to see the movie.
Yeah.
And they claim they have 24 point something
Wow.
surround sound. And I was sitting there. It was Prometheus.
Yeah.
Right, the
Okay.
movie. Great sound. It came from the front. And I thought, okay, I don't care much about surround sound.
Yeah.
Because for me it's about the impact and the content.
Yeah.
But I was like checking out, okay, they charge €4 more, so what do I get? And then I like turned around, so the screen was there, and I realized, okay, the orchestra hit comes from here, and I can hear the tail of the reverb coming from here. But sitting in front of the screen, that doesn't make any sense for the experience.
Right, yeah.
So I think there's still, I mean, in the year 14 after the introduction of 5.1.
We have to bear in mind here that if you look at another genre of music here, electroacoustic musicians have been doing this since probably the 50s or the 60s. If you go to a great installation where, I mean, I work in Norway quite a lot, and I don't know if you know about Notam in Oslo. It's a electroacoustic, or it's a kind of centre for study, and they work with with ambisonics there a lot. And one of the things which, I mean, I'm not professing to be an expert on this, I merely have a passing interest, but one of the things which occurred to me was I saw a couple of installations where they were using 99 speakers and all of this, and it does open up a whole dimension. The problem you have is, does it only work in that installation? So I mean, obviously as soon as you move around the room, it changes completely. So yeah, I am sympathetic, and I love the idea of this surround, but there are so many variables.
Yeah.
So many.
That's true. Maybe I think there should be clubs in the cities which are equipped for surround, and if a band goes in there, they could like play in surround.
Yeah.
Because if the system would be perfected for that place, it really could make a difference, and the mixers could become pretty creative. Well, it seems not to have gotten the attention of the public and the consumers. So
No.
I don't expect to pick up, apart from the headphone stuff. Well, but so far we have touched a lot of subjects already, and I'm sure there's so much more, and I'm sure we will come back and talk to you about more stuff, especially as we now collected some ideas, projects which we might be able to do. So more about this soon. So far, thanks a lot to Gary for the time and sharing his story and his experiences.
Get the creative juices flowing, and to think out of the box a little.
And so this is on YouTube, obviously. So if you have questions regarding your mixes, production tricks, career advice, questions who might do what in which way in terms of artists, because Gary is pretty well connected in the British music scene and even in other areas as well. So please let us know, and we will pick up that conversation from there and answer your question on a frequent basis. You are on Skype, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So okay, thanks a lot, Gary.
Pleasure.
See you soon, and thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Bye bye.